a 58-year-old widow forced to confront inheritance betrayal, family lies, hidden identities, and the painful truth that her own daughter knew more than she ever admitted. As shocking secrets emerge after her husband's death, Margaret discovers her marriage was connected to a generational scheme far bigger than she imagined. Before we start next, take a moment to subscribe our channel if you really like this content, and comment below from where you are watching us. I will love to know. The woman standing beside the reception hall door was watching me with relief on her face while my husband's funeral cake dried untouched beneath fluorescent lights, and I remember thinking that grief should not look like relief unless someone had finally escaped something. The room smelled like instant coffee and rain-soaked wool coats. Cups clinked softly against saucers. Someone behind me laughed too loudly, the sound sharp enough to make my shoulders tighten beneath my black dress. I had known these people for 30 years. Church friends, hospital friends, neighbors, the kinds of people who believed they knew the shape of your marriage because they had seen you bring potato salad to barbecues and hold hands in parking lots and sit together in pews every Christmas Eve. But the woman by the door was someone I had never seen before, and she was watching me like a person waiting for confirmation. I felt it immediately. Nurses learn to notice what people try not to show. Breathing patterns, eye movement, the way fear sits in the jaw before it reaches the voice. I had spent 30 years pretending not to notice certain things at home because some truths become impossible to survive once you fully allow yourself to see them. But that woman, I noticed her. Her dark coat still wet from the rain, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her, the strange softness in her expression every time she looked at me, as though she pitied me and envied me at the same time. I moved quietly toward Patricia. Robert's sister stood beside the tea urn, pouring hot water she wasn't drinking. Steam fogged her glasses. Her lipstick had faded into the lines around her mouth. "Who is that woman by the door?" I asked softly. Patricia looked up and froze. Just for a second. One beat too long? "I don't know," she said. The lie arrived before the sentence ended. I knew it instantly. You might wonder how. But after 30 years as a nurse, you learn that lies live in the body before they reach the mouth. Patricia's fingers tightened around the teapot handle, hard enough for her knuckles to pale. Her breathing changed. Tiny things. Tiny, truthful things. The woman looked toward us then. Toward Patricia. And Patricia looked away too quickly. My chest tightened. Across the room, someone opened the hall doors, and cold November air drifted inside, carrying the smell of wet leaves and traffic. The woman took one final look at me. Then she left. By the time I reached the door, she was gone. Only rain remained. That night, the house sounded wrong without Robert in it. The refrigerator hummed too loudly. Pipes clicked softly inside the walls. Wind brushed branches against the bedroom window with a scratching sound that made sleep impossible. I stayed downstairs. There were practical things to do. Death creates paperwork faster than grief can process it. Insurance, bank accounts, funeral invoices. I sat in Robert's study with a mug of tea growing cold beside me and opened the bottom desk drawer where he kept important documents. The room smelled faintly of aftershave and old paper. My wedding photograph sat beside the lamp. 35 years. I remember touching the frame with numb fingers and thinking how strange it was that a person could vanish while all their objects remained so certain they still existed. I found tax folders first. Property forms, receipts, nothing unusual. Then my hand touched something cold beneath a stack of envelopes. A phone, not Robert's regular phone. A different one, black, smaller, no case. My pulse stumbled. I stared at it for a long time, while rain tapped softly against the window. The phone felt cold in my palm, heavier than it should have. Locked. No messages visible. No notifications. Nothing. But people do not keep secret phones for innocent reasons. That is what I thought then. And what I did not know yet was that I was still imagining a much smaller betrayal than the one waiting for me. I slipped the phone into my cardigan pocket just as thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Then I sat very still, because suddenly I remembered something Patricia had said 20 years earlier at a Christmas dinner after too much wine and too much silence. You don't know him as well as you think you do, Margaret. I had dismissed her immediately. Robert had laughed softly afterward while we loaded dishes into the dishwasher. Patricia likes creating drama when she feels left out, he had told me gently. You know how she gets. And because I loved him, because I trusted him, because marriage sometimes means choosing which version of reality feels safest, I believed him. That distinction would cost me almost everything. I finally went upstairs after midnight. The bed felt enormous. Cold sheets. The faint smell of Robert's cologne still lingering in the pillows. I lay awake, staring into darkness while the phone rested inside my bedside drawer like something alive. At 3 a.m, I took it back out, held it in both hands. The screen reflected my face, pale and unfamiliar, in the dark room. I had been married to Robert for 35 years. I thought I knew every corner of his life. That night, I held a phone in my hands that told me I had never known him at all. But what I found on it was not what I expected. It was so much worse. The phone was unlocked by my neighbor's teenage son at 10 the next morning while the smell of burnt toast drifted from his mother's kitchen, and within 30 seconds I realized I had spent the entire night preparing myself for the wrong betrayal. I didn't look at anything, the boy said quickly, handing the phone back to me. I just reset the lock. His sneakers squeaked against the tile floor as he retreated toward the hallway. I thanked him, my voice sounding distant even to me. Rainwater dripped steadily outside from the gutters. Somewhere nearby, a lawnmower buzzed. My hands shook as I opened the phone. I expected messages from another woman, photographs, hotel bookings. Something ordinary in its cruelty. Instead, I found spreadsheets, financial records, property transfers, legal documents photographed and stored in folders labeled with dates I didn't recognize. I frowned. Then I saw Claire's name. Once, twice, again, everywhere. Texts, emails, documents. Claire knew about this phone. My daughter had been communicating with her father through it for years. I sat down so quickly the chair legs scraped harshly against the floor. The kitchen smelled like stale coffee and dish soap. Sunlight pressed weakly through clouds beyond the sink window. I opened another thread, and another. Claire discussing meetings. Claire forwarding financial forms. Claire asking if Mum suspects anything. The room tilted slightly. No affair could have hurt like this. A stranger betrays you from outside your life. A child betrays you from inside it. I need you to understand what this meant. Claire was not just my daughter. She was the person I trusted most instinctively in the world after Robert. The child I had stayed awake beside during fevers. The teenager I defended through heartbreaks and mistakes and bad decisions. The grown woman whose voice still softened something inside me every time she called me Mom. And now I was staring at evidence that she had shared a secret life with her father for at least 3 years. Maybe longer? I kept scrolling. The phone vibrated suddenly in my hand, and I nearly dropped it. A message notification. Unknown number. Everything arranged. Meeting postponed until after funeral. My stomach tightened. Meeting? What meeting? I opened the photo files next. Most were document images. Contracts? Signatures. Then one photograph stopped me cold. A will. Not Robert's current will. An older one? I recognized the signature instantly, but my name was nowhere in it. Not once. Instead, the primary beneficiaries were listed under something called Hartley Holdings Limited, and Claire's name appeared beneath it. Director. I stared so long my eyes watered. Outside, a truck rattled past the house. The vibration hummed faintly through the kitchen floor beneath my bare feet. My daughter. My husband. A company I had never heard of. I called Claire immediately. No answer. Again, voicemail. Again, nothing. My chest felt too tight to breathe properly. I walked into the living room and back again, the phone cold against my sweating palm. By the fourth unanswered call, I stopped leaving messages. By the sixth, I understood she was avoiding me deliberately. Then my phone rang. Patricia? The timing hit me like ice water. I answered without speaking. Her voice came low and careful through the line. Margaret, before you do anything, before you speak to anyone, I need to tell you something. I closed my eyes. The house smelled faintly of lilies from the funeral arrangements already beginning to rot in their vases. I tried to tell you 20 years ago, Patricia continued quietly, and you wouldn't hear it. I need you to hear it now. Thunder rolled somewhere far away. I sat slowly at the dining table. The same table where Robert had carved Christmas turkey every year. The same table where Claire colored pictures while I cooked dinner. The same table where I suddenly no longer knew what had been real. Tell me, I whispered. Patricia inhaled shakily. And this is the part where everything changes. Because in that moment I realized something terrible about Robert. Something I should have recognized years earlier. He always knew exactly what people needed emotionally in order to stop asking difficult questions. He knew how to sound wounded when challenged. He knew how to sound patient when lying. He knew how to make protection feel like love. Patricia had tried to warn me once. I had called her jealous and petty, and I had told Robert, and he had smiled and said exactly what I needed to hear. I understand now that was not an accident. He always knew exactly what I needed to hear. That was perhaps his greatest skill and his most deliberate weapon. Patricia told me the house wasn't ours, while steam rose untouched from the tea between us, and somehow that hurt more than discovering my daughter had lied to me. We met at a quiet cafe near the river where old couples usually sat reading newspapers in silence. The place smelled like cinnamon and burnt espresso. Rain streaked the windows in silver lines while traffic hissed outside on wet pavement. Patricia looked exhausted, not guilty, exhausted, like someone who had carried a heavy object too long. I rehearsed this conversation 100 times, she admitted softly, wrapping both hands around her mug. None of the versions sounded survivable. I sat across from her with my coat still damp at the shoulders, trying to hold my expression steady. Start anyway. She nodded once. Robert's company exists. It's been operating for 15 years. Property management, investments, holdings. She paused. You're not part of it legally. I stared at her. What do you mean legally? I mean everything you thought was jointly owned isn't. The cafe door opened behind me with a burst of cold air, and coffee beans roasting somewhere in the back filled the silence between us. Patricia continued carefully. The house belongs to the company. I laughed once. Not because it was funny, because sometimes shock exits the body, sounding almost like amusement. No, I said immediately. That's impossible. We bought that house together. Patricia's eyes filled briefly with something close to pity. The company bought it 12 years ago during refinancing. My fingers went numb around the teacup. 12 years. I remembered signing paperwork quickly before leaving for a hospital shift. Robert standing beside me explaining interest rates and tax structures while I skimmed pages I barely read because I trusted him completely. Strong women are often taught that asking too many questions makes them difficult. I had mistaken silence for partnership. And the company, Patricia said carefully, is not solely Robert's. I looked at her. The cafe noise faded strangely distant around me. Claire has been a director since she turned 25. Everything inside me stopped. Just for a second, I could actually hear the refrigerator humming behind the counter, hear teaspoons tapping porcelain, hear rain ticking softly against glass. 7 years! Claire had known for 7 years. I pressed trembling fingers against my mouth. Patricia leaned forward slightly. Margaret, no. My voice cracked sharply. No, don't defend her yet. I'm not. But her face said she wanted to. And that almost made me angrier. You might wonder why betrayal from a child feels different from betrayal from a husband. Because husbands arrive in your life as strangers. Children begin as part of your own body. I looked down at my hands. Nurse hands, dry skin, small scars from decades of latex gloves and winter hospital air. Hands that had held dying people with more certainty than I currently felt holding my own life together. There is one more thing, Patricia said quietly. The thing I tried to tell you 20 years ago. I looked up slowly. The reason Robert worked so hard to make you dismiss me, the room seemed colder suddenly. Tell me. Patricia looked at her hands for several long seconds before speaking. Robert was not who he told you he was when you met him. A strange pressure built in my chest. What does that mean? His name wasn't Robert Hartley. I blinked. He changed it legally before he met you? The sound of dishes crashing faintly somewhere in the kitchen made me jump. Patricia kept speaking in the same careful voice. The stories he told about his childhood, his parents, the family history, most of it doesn't exist. I stared at her blankly. No, not blankly. Defensively. Because even then, part of me was still trying to protect the man I loved from information that made loving him dangerous. You knew this? I whispered. Not all of it, not then. Patricia swallowed hard. I'm his sister, but I'm not really his sister. We don't share parents. I was already grown when my mother brought him home and told everyone he was her son. The cafe suddenly felt too warm. My skin prickled beneath my sweater. I never knew where he came from, Patricia continued. Neither did anyone else, but things never added up. Documents disappeared, dates changed, stories changed slightly every few years. She shook her head slowly. And then you married him. I remembered Patricia at our wedding. Stiff smile, tight eyes. Robert squeezing my hand afterward and whispering, "Don't mind her. She's protective in strange ways." I had believed him? Of course I had. When I tried to warn you, Patricia said softly, he made sure you thought I was jealous. And after that, I stayed quiet because every time I looked at you, I realized you were happy. Her voice broke slightly on the word happy, and suddenly I understood something painful. Patricia had not stayed silent because she didn't care. She stayed silent because she thought the truth would destroy me. Then who was he? I whispered. Patricia looked out at the rain. That is what I spent 20 years trying to find out. A bus roared past outside, spraying water across the street. And 3 weeks before he died, she said quietly, I finally did. She reached beside her chair, lifted a worn leather bag onto the table, then slowly removed a thick folder. My pulse hammered. Patricia placed it carefully between us. I need you to understand what this meant, she whispered. Because once you open this, your life divides into before and after. I stared at the folder. Brown paper edges, paper clips, photographs visible through partially open sections. I suddenly thought about the woman at the funeral again, the relief on her face. And then I understood. The relief had not been for Robert's death. It had been for mine. She thought I already knew. She was relieved I had finally found out. Patricia rested her hand lightly on the folder before I touched it. Before you open that, she said carefully, I need you to know that what is in there changes not just who Robert was, it changes who you are, and it changes who Claire is. And once you know it, you cannot unknow it. My fingers shook against the cardboard edge. Outside, the rain intensified. Inside the cafe, every sound seemed suddenly far away. I opened the folder. The first photograph in the folder was of Robert standing beside a woman I had never seen before and a little boy who had his exact eyes. And the moment I saw it, I understood that grief had not even begun yet. The paper smelled old, dusty, like attic boxes untouched for years. My fingertips trembled as I lifted the photograph closer beneath the cafe light. Robert looked younger, maybe 20. Darker hair, different clothes than the polished man I met years later. Beside him stood the woman from the funeral. Same eyes, same guarded expression, his real sister. I looked up slowly at Patricia. Her name is Helen, Patricia said quietly. My chest tightened painfully. And the little boy? Patricia hesitated. I don't know. The answer chilled me more than certainty would have. Buses hissed past outside in the rain. Someone near the counter laughed softly. Ordinary life continued while mine quietly split open. Beneath the photograph were birth records. A different name, Daniel Mercer, born in a small town 4 hours north of where Robert claimed to grow up. I mouthed the name silently. Daniel, not Robert. The sound felt foreign inside my mouth. Patricia watched me carefully. If you like this story, drop a comment below. This helps channel grow and reach more people like you. There was another family first, she explained. A wealthy one. Old money, property, land, trusts. She paused. Complicated inheritance structures. I kept reading. Legal copies, trust conditions, requirements, marriage clauses, lineage documentation, and slowly the shape of it emerged. Robert Daniel had not met the conditions necessary to inherit under his grandfather's trust, but there were loopholes. Marriage, stability, respectability, the appearance of the correct kind of family life, a nurse wife, a child, community standing, paperwork, structures. My stomach turned violently. He married me for an inheritance, I said. The sentence landed flat between us. Patricia inhaled slowly. Yes, I closed my eyes. The cafe smelled overwhelmingly of coffee suddenly. Bitter enough to make me nauseous. 35 years. Christmas mornings. Hospital pickups. Vacations. Holding hands during my father's funeral. All of it rearranging itself inside my mind like furniture shifting during an earthquake. But Margaret, I opened my eyes sharply. What possible sentence comes after that? Patricia looked devastated. I do not believe he only loved you for that reason. I almost laughed again. Almost, but something in her face stopped me. From everything I watched across 35 years, she continued quietly, I think the original plan became something else. I think you became something real to him. That is not comfort, Patricia. No, her eyes filled. I know. I'm not offering comfort. I'm offering truth. You deserve the whole truth, not the simple version. Simple version. Villains are simple. Real people almost never are. That was the terrible thing. If Robert had been entirely cruel, entirely false, perhaps it would have hurt less. But memory refused to cooperate. Even sitting there with proof of deception in my hands, I could still remember him warming my feet against his legs in winter, sitting beside my hospital bed after my appendix surgery, crying quietly when Claire left for university. What I did not know yet was that love and manipulation can coexist so thoroughly that separating them afterward becomes almost impossible. Patricia reached deeper into the folder. There is more. Of course there was. There is always more. She removed several letters tied with fading blue ribbon. My breath caught. I recognized the handwriting instantly. My mother's. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Where did you get those? Through the investigation into Robert's background, Patricia said softly. A retired solicitor kept archived correspondence connected to the original inheritance dispute. These were among the records. My fingers shook violently, taking them. My mother had died 28 years earlier in a car accident on a wet November road. I still remembered the smell of rain at her funeral, still remembered the cold numbness in my knees standing beside the grave. I unfolded the first letter carefully. Old paper crackled softly beneath my fingertips. Dear Evelyn, I am becoming increasingly concerned that Margaret's husband is not who he claims to be. My pulse hammered, letter after letter. My mother describing inconsistencies, documents she couldn't verify, stories that shifted, questions Robert answered too smoothly. I pressed my hand against my mouth. She knew, not everything, but enough to be afraid. Enough to investigate quietly. And then suddenly, the letters stopped. Patricia handed me the final page separately. Unfinished. The ink faded slightly at the bottom where the sentence broke off. I have found something about Robert that Margaret must never... Nothing after that. No ending. No explanation. My throat closed completely. She died 3 weeks later, I whispered. Patricia said nothing. The silence itself answered too much. I looked at her sharply. Patricia, I don't know, she said immediately, eyes wet. I swear to you I don't know, but the timing, she died in a car accident? Yes. On a wet road? Yes. Are you saying Robert? I am saying I don't know. But fear sat visibly beneath her words, and once fear enters a room, imagination follows quickly behind it. I stared at my mother's unfinished sentence. Rain rattled harder against the windows now. The sky outside darkened toward evening. My chest physically hurt, because suddenly memory itself became contaminated. Every story I had trusted, every explanation, every certainty, all of it unstable now. You might wonder how a person survives, learning their life may have been designed before they entered it. The answer is that the body continues functioning long after the mind stops understanding reality. I kept breathing. I kept turning pages. I kept listening, because there was no other option. Patricia leaned closer across the table. I think you need to speak to Mr. Graham before the official will reading. I looked up slowly. Why? Robert visited him 8 months ago. So? It wasn't about the will. A chill slid through me. What was it about? He made Graham promise confidentiality, but afterward, Graham contacted an investigator connected to the inheritance structure. Patricia hesitated. Whatever Robert discovered near the end of his life frightened him. Outside, thunder cracked, suddenly loud enough to shake the glass. I flinched hard. Patricia touched my wrist gently for the first time in 20 years. I think he was trying to undo something, she whispered. I drove home through streets I had driven for 35 years. Past the primary school where I used to collect Claire holding little paper paintings in her hands. Past the hospital where I worked night shifts while Robert slept beside an empty place in bed. Past the church where I married a man whose real name I still could not say aloud without feeling disoriented. Every familiar thing now wore a different face. The windshield wipers beat steadily through cold November rain. Wet asphalt reflected traffic lights in trembling red streaks, and all I could think about was my mother's unfinished sentence. I had always believed her death was an accident on a wet road in November. I had never had a reason to believe anything else. I was beginning to understand that reason and truth are not always the same thing. and that the most dangerous lies are the ones we are given no reason to question. Mr. Graham told me Robert was trying to undo everything while the smell of polished wood and old legal paper filled his office, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt something more complicated than betrayal. I felt grief again, real grief, because suddenly Robert became a man running out of time instead of a man simply hiding secrets. Mr. Graham's office overlooked the town square where rainwater gathered in shallow silver pools beside benches. The radiator clicked softly beneath the window. Somewhere downstairs a phone rang repeatedly. He looked uncomfortable the moment I mentioned Patricia, then even more uncomfortable when I placed my mother's unfinished letter on his desk. "I know about the company," I said quietly. "I know about the inheritance structure. I know Robert wasn't his real name." Mr. Graham removed his glasses slowly. The silence stretched. I watched him carefully. Nurses become experts at watching hesitation, and his hesitation told me more than his words ever would. "What did Robert come here to change 8 months ago?" I asked. He folded his hands together tightly. "There are legal limitations on what I can discuss. Of course there are. But..." He stopped, then started again. "He came to alter certain structures that had existed for many years, not the will." "No." My pulse quickened. "What structures?" Again the hesitation. Then quietly, "Ownership pathways, transfer protections, contingency clauses." I stared at him, slowly understanding he was trying to undo it. Mr. Graham looked away toward the rain. "I cannot confirm that directly." "You don't need to." The office suddenly smelled strongly of dust and coffee. My chest tightened with something dangerously close to sorrow, because if Robert had spent his final months trying to dismantle the very lies he built, what had changed? Love? Guilt? Fear? All three? What frightened him? I asked softly. Mr. Graham's jaw tightened. "I truly cannot answer that." But again, his body answered for him. Fear. Robert had been afraid near the end. And this is the part where everything changes. Because until then, I had imagined myself as the only victim of Robert's deception. I had not considered that Robert himself might eventually have become trapped inside the machinery he created. When I left Mr. Graham's office, the rain had stopped. Cold air smelled like wet pavement and chimney smoke. My shoes scraped softly across damp sidewalks as I walked toward my car. I drove directly to Claire's house. The entire way my stomach churned. Anger, fear, maternal instinct. Those emotions do not separate cleanly. Claire opened the door after my second knock, and immediately I knew Patricia had been right about one thing. My daughter had been suffering for years. Guilt sat all over her face. Not defensive guilt, not manipulative guilt. The exhausted kind. The kind that hollows people slowly from the inside. "Mum?" Her voice cracked instantly. I stepped inside without answering. The house smelled like vanilla candles and laundry detergent. Somewhere upstairs, a television murmured faintly. Claire wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself as though cold. We stood facing each other in her kitchen. Mother, daughter, strangers? "How long?" I asked quietly. Claire closed her eyes. "I found out when I was 25. 7 years. The number slammed through me again, and you said nothing." Tears filled her eyes immediately. "He told me it was for your protection." I laughed sharply. "My protection?" "He said the company structure kept everything safe legally, that eventually everything would transfer to you anyway." "And you believed him?" Claire stared at the floor. Long silence. Then I wanted to believe him. There it was. The truth. Not innocence. Not evil. Something much more human and painful. "What was the alternative?" she whispered. "The alternative was accepting my father had built our whole life on lies." The alternative was telling me, yes. She looked up finally. And I chose him. No excuses, no self-defense, just truth. Oddly, that hurt more. I have hated myself for it every single day, Claire whispered. Every time you talked about retirement plans, every time you trusted him, every Christmas dinner, every birthday. Her breathing shook. I kept thinking I would tell you eventually. Then more years passed and it became impossible. I leaned against the counter because suddenly my legs felt weak. The kitchen clock ticked loudly. A dog barked faintly somewhere outside. I need you to understand what this meant, I said quietly. You were the one person in my life I thought could never become unsafe. Claire cried then, not dramatically, silently. The kind of crying adults do when they know tears cannot fix what already happened. I know. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and lemon cleaner. I studied my daughter carefully. And beneath the guilt, I saw something else. Fear? What aren't you telling me? Claire wiped her face quickly. Dad told me something during the last week of his life. Every nerve in my body tightened. What? She hesitated, then turned toward the kitchen drawer beside the refrigerator. My pulse hammered as she pulled out a thick envelope. My name was written across the front in Robert's handwriting. The sight of it nearly broke me. 35 years of grocery lists, anniversary cards, notes left beside kettles. I would have recognized his handwriting anywhere. He asked me to give you this when you were ready, Claire whispered. My fingers felt numb taking it. He said you would know when? I looked at my daughter. When would I be ready? When would anyone be ready for a letter from a man they had loved for 35 years and never known at all? And then I thought about my mother's unfinished sentence. The wet road in November. The things we are never ready for come anyway. I opened the envelope. Robert admitted in the first page of the letter that his real name was Daniel Mercer, but it was the third page that made my hands begin to shake so violently I had to place the paper flat against Claire's kitchen table. The letter smelled faintly of cedar and old cologne. His cologne, for one terrible second. That scent alone almost destroyed me. Claire sat across from me in silence while late afternoon light dimmed slowly beyond the curtains. A kettle clicked softly as it cooled on the stove. I began reading, not quickly, because every paragraph rearranged another section of my life. His real name? Daniel Mercer. I mouthed it silently again. He wrote about his childhood first. Foster homes, violence, poverty, the wealthy Mercer family discovering him years later through blood records after his grandfather died without a clear heir. I closed my eyes briefly. So that part at least had truth inside it. Not the version he told, but truth. The inheritance structure required legitimacy, stability, family presentation. He admitted changing his name before meeting me because he wanted distance from the Mercer disputes already forming around him. Then came the paragraph explaining why he chose me. Not because I was wealthy, not because I was vulnerable, because I looked trustworthy. I physically stopped breathing for a second reading that line. You looked like someone who built honest things, he wrote. My throat tightened painfully. A nurse, steady, reliable, kind, the perfect woman to help create the appearance of permanence. At first, those two words mattered, because further down the letter, his tone changed completely. He wrote about falling in love with me slowly against his own intentions, about watching me care for my dying father, about hearing me sing quietly while gardening, about realizing somewhere along the way that the constructed life had become the only real thing he possessed. I pressed trembling fingers against my lips. What did he say? Claire whispered. I could barely answer. He says he loved me. The sentence sounded absurd and devastating simultaneously. Claire watched my face carefully. Does that matter? I stared down at the paper for a long time. Rain began softly outside again, tapping against the windows. I don't know yet, I whispered honestly. Ask me in a year? Because what was love worth once built inside manipulation? And yet, if the feeling itself had been real, did that erase it or deepen the betrayal? Robert wrote about the company next, about trying to protect assets from legal seizure if the Mercer inheritance dispute reopened, about bringing Claire into it after discovering he was ill, about convincing himself secrecy was protection. That word again, protection. Men like Robert often rename control as protection because it sounds gentler. Then I reached the paragraph about my mother, and everything inside me went still. The kitchen sounds faded entirely. Robert admitted my mother had discovered inconsistencies in his past decades earlier. He claimed he met with her privately after receiving one of her letters. Claimed she threatened to expose him unless he told me the truth. My chest tightened so sharply it hurt. Then came the sentence that changed everything again. He wrote that he begged her for time because by then he truly loved me and feared losing the only real family he had ever known. I closed my eyes hard because part of me believed him. That was the unbearable thing. But then another line. Your mother agreed to wait before telling you. 3 weeks later, she died. My fingers went cold. No admission, no direct accusation, nothing explicit. And yet the absence itself screamed. I kept reading. Robert swore repeatedly he had nothing to do with the accident. But the desperation in his writing terrified me more than certainty would have. People explain too much when they fear being disbelieved. What I did not know yet was that the letter itself had been written by a man already terrified someone intended to silence him next. Toward the end, his handwriting changed slightly. Less controlled, more rushed, he wrote about discovering people within the Mercer structure had no intention of allowing him to dissolve the company arrangements protecting their financial interests. He wrote about arguments, threats, meetings, fear. Then finally, if anything happens to me before I can correct this, you must speak to Helen. I read the sentence twice. 3 times. Then the final paragraph, Margaret, if love without honesty still counts as love, then I loved you every day of my life. If it does not count, then perhaps this letter changes nothing. Either way, I am sorry for building a life where truth always arrived too late. I lowered the letter slowly. The room smelled like rain and cooling tea. Claire watched me with terrified eyes. Mom? Are you? He loved me, I whispered. The words felt strange. In his completely wrong, entirely dishonest, fundamentally broken way, I swallowed hard. He loved me. Claire cried quietly again. I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside my coat pocket over my heart, then sat silently for several minutes while the rain intensified outside. Finally, I stood. I need to make one phone call. Claire wiped her face. To who? Helen. The number Patricia provided connected on the 3rd ring. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then a woman's voice. Careful. Guarded. I wondered how long it would take. The sound of her voice sent chills through me. There was something familiar in it, something that reminded me painfully of Robert. I came to the funeral because I needed to see your face, she continued quietly. I needed to know if you knew. And if I didn't, silence. Then softly, then I was going to tell you myself. I leaned against Claire's kitchen counter. My knees felt weak. I needed to know if you were safe, Helen added. The word hit me immediately. Safe. Safe from what? Long pause. Then, from the people who did not want Robert undoing what he had done. Every nerve in my body tightened. Helen, Margaret, she interrupted softly. Robert did not die of a heart attack. The room tilted. I gripped the phone with both hands. 35 years of marriage, a second phone, a folder of secrets, my mother's unfinished letter. And now this. Helen's voice came very careful, very quiet. I have already spoken to the police. They are investigating privately because of financial implications connected to the Mercer holdings. I could barely breathe. What are you saying? I'm saying your husband became dangerous to certain people the moment he tried dismantling the structures protecting the inheritance. Rain hammered the windows now. Claire stared at me pale and frightened from across the kitchen. But Margaret, Helen whispered, there is one more thing you need to know about who benefits from Robert never undoing what he had done, about who had a reason to make sure he ran out of time. I thought immediately about Claire, then Patricia, then Mr. Graham. But Helen said a different name entirely, and it was none of them. The name Helen gave me belonged to Diane's husband, and the moment I heard it, I understood why every instinct inside me had trusted Diane from the beginning, while recoiling slightly from the man she married. His name was Andrew Collins, an accountant, quiet, forgettable, peripheral to my life in exactly the way dangerous people often prefer to be. I sat in my dark living room after the call ended, while the smell of rain drifted through the cracked window beside me. The grandfather clock ticked steadily near the staircase. My fingers felt ice cold, wrapped around untouched tea. Andrew had worked briefly with one of the Mercer financial subsidiaries years earlier. Not high enough to matter publicly, but high enough to access information, high enough to facilitate transfers, high enough to lose everything if Robert dismantled the structures before investigators finished tracing the money. You might wonder how someone ordinary becomes capable of terrible things. Usually slowly, usually through self-justification, usually through fear. Police investigations moved quietly afterward. No dramatic arrests, no courtroom confessions, just evidence, bank records, messages, meetings reconstructed piece by piece. It turned out Robert really had been trying to undo the company arrangements during his final year. Certain financial protections had begun unraveling. People connected to the inheritance feared exposure. Andrew Collins had arranged one final private meeting with Robert 2 days before his death. After that, the quiet machinery of consequence began turning exactly as it should. Slowly, without spectacle. I found I no longer needed spectacle anyway. The truth itself was exhausting enough. What mattered more was what remained. Claire started visiting every Sunday afternoon. At first, our conversations were careful and uneven, like people crossing ice they did not yet trust. The house would smell like soup simmering on the stove, while winter light faded softly through the kitchen windows. Sometimes we spoke about Robert. Sometimes we avoided him entirely, but the pretending stopped. That changed everything. One evening, Claire found me sitting at the dining table with my mother's unfinished letter spread open beside fresh paper. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. I looked up, finishing it. She sat beside me silently while I wrote the words my mother never had the chance to complete. "I have found something about Robert that Margaret must never be kept from knowing. She deserves the truth. She has always deserved the truth." I cried afterward. Not loudly, just enough. And somehow that felt like the first honest grief of the entire process. Mr. Graham eventually helped untangle the company structures Robert had tried desperately to dismantle before he died. It took nearly 2 years of legal work, meetings, documents, hearings, exhaustion. But I kept the house. I did not leave. That mattered to me more than I expected. Because survival sometimes means refusing displacement. Helen became something strange and unexpected in my life after everything settled. Not family exactly, not friendship exactly, more like a witness. Someone else who had loved Robert while never fully knowing him. Someone else trying to separate the real parts from the false ones without destroying either completely. Once a month, she came for tea. We sat in the garden beneath cold spring sunlight, speaking about Daniel and Robert, almost as though they were two different men. Maybe in some ways they were. Diane visited often too. One evening, she found me kneeling in the garden, pressing seedlings carefully into fresh soil. The air smelled rich with rain and earth. Birds chattered softly in nearby hedges while dusk settled blue across the yard. "How are you actually?" she asked gently. I sat back on my heels slowly. So much had changed that answering honestly required thought. I am 35 years of one life and the beginning of a completely different one, I said, both at the same time. Diane smiled faintly. "It sounds exhausting." "It is." I brushed soil from my palms. And surprisingly, not terrible. Because here was the strange truth nobody tells you about devastation. Once everything false collapses, whatever remains begins breathing differently. More painfully, perhaps, but more honestly, too. Diane looked toward the flower beds. "You planted something new." I nodded. "My mother's favorites. Small, pale flowers. Nothing dramatic. She used to grow them beside our old porch when I was little. I had always meant to ask her properly how to care for them. I never did. I should have learned while she was alive," I said quietly. "I'm learning now instead. Better late." Diane crouched beside me. "Is it hard?" I looked down at dirt beneath my fingernails, at roots disappearing carefully into dark soil, at my hands, older now, steadier somehow. "Everything worth doing is hard," I said softly. "That's not a reason. That's just the price." The evening air cooled around us, carrying distant traffic sounds and the faint smell of someone's fireplace beginning nearby. Inside the house, the lights glowed warm through kitchen windows. Home. Still home, despite everything. Margaret never found a simple word for what her life had been. Not a lie, because it had contained real love, and even broken, misdirected love remains a form of love. Not a truth, because too much had been hidden, too much managed, too much decided for her without her consent. It was something in between. The way most lives are something in between. What she knew now, what she carried forward like her mother's flowers finally growing in her garden, was this: the truth does not always arrive when we are ready for it. It arrives when it arrives, and the only question that ever truly matters is what we choose to do once we are no longer looking away. Margaret chose to look. Margaret chose to stay. Margaret chose to plant something new in the same ground where difficult things had grown. And every morning she went outside early before the house fully woke up and checked what was beginning to come through the soil. Every morning the air smelled different. Wet earth, cold dawn, summer rain, and every morning something was. If Margaret's story stayed with you, share it with someone today. And if you want to know what happened next, we will be here every week. Another story, another woman, another life that refused to stay broken.